Very sadly, Pat Mitchell is not able to join us, but I'm be delighted with my two colleagues to be part of the Women's Leadership Forum. Climate Change, the Great Leveller, is the title given our panel this morning. Appropriate, since the climate emergency and the attendant weather-related catastrophes, rising seas, more weather disturbances like hurricanes, raging fires, extremes in temperature and resulting food shortages, depletion of oxygen to sustain life, outcomes of climate change being felt everywhere, and, like many global threats, being experienced disproportionately by the world's already most vulnerable communities. What can we do, women leaders from governments, business, social sector, to reverse the man-made challenges to create just and sustainable solutions? We need, as one of the women leaders joining us this morning has famously said, a feminist solution. All three of the leaders both of the leaders I have the privilege of speaking with this morning are women leading for these solutions that will be a leveler for others. Leaders who possess, through enough hope and radical optimism, to believe that the world can agree to the necessary changes to meet the biggest global threat of all, an uninhabitable planet. Christiana Figueres took on what many thought was a thankless or impossible task, attempting to lead the world's leaders to a global agreement on actions necessary to address the climate emergency. There was widespread pessimism as other UN climate summits had failed to reach an agreement. But Christiana took up the leadership with what she calls radical optimism. And in 2015, in Paris, a global agreement was signed by 165 countries, an agreement that would put the world on a path to a different future, the future we choose. The name of her book, which is a must if you want to stay hopeful about the future and find ways to participate in it. So Christiana, let's begin with an update on the agreement since Paris. We know that the US, under the current president, left the agreement even though the US had signed it under President Obama. With a newly elected president-elect who has committed to returning as a signature to the agreement, how does this change the outlook? And where are we as a global community towards the future? Over to you, Christiana.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary. And first of all, well, thank you for the invitation to all of us to join the forum today. And Mary, thank you very much for standing in for poor Pat, who's totally lost her internet connection in the nick of time, unfortunately. But Mary, I want to make sure that since we actually were going to have a conversation among the three of us, Damilola, you and me, that please do chime in and out. Just because you've now stepped in to moderate, please don't let that contain your sharing of your thoughts and opinions, which are always so valuable. So where are we? Well, I would say a couple of things. First, before we go to geopolitics, which has clearly shifted lately, let's just remember that there is, as compared to where we were 5 years ago, there is much more public awareness of the impacts of climate change. And that for many reasons, but I think the top two are because we are witnessing much, much bigger impacts. Just if you just look at wildfires, they have been bigger and more expensive than ever before. In the last 12 to 18 months, we have been having fires from the Amazon to Siberia, from California to Australia, and all of them have been bigger and more expensive than any time before. Also, the second reason why public awareness is raising is because of young people in the streets and many not so young people accompanying them. So exciting to see that most of those young women, most of those young people are led by young women. And that is something that we really have to celebrate all around the world. So many young women stepping up to lead their generation forward. Yeah. Now, just as we have grown in the public awareness, we have also, thank heavens, grown in the solution space. So, as we know, the United States will be rejoining the Paris Agreement in January as probably the number one, or at least the number two, executive order that the newly minted President Biden will sign into execution as soon as he steps into the White House. But let's remember that the United States is joining a group of countries that have already been leading forward. So he's joining the EU that has been very clear about the green and social inclusion component of their recovery package to COVID. He's joining China that has come out recently, personally, President Xi Jinping, to give his long-term targets of decarbonization or peaking emissions for China. The United States is joining Japan and Korea that have also come out. So the United States will frankly be playing catch up to a very important group of industrialized countries that have understood that they need to move their economy to net zero by 2050, in the case of China at the latest by 2060, as he has or before, as President Xi Jinping has said. So the geopolitics has shifted remarkably on this issue just in the past 6 months. Investors, very important shift. We have an increasing concern of capital markets for the devaluation that could occur if financial shifts are not done quickly enough. And that is why there is a huge expectation and demand for disclosure of climate risk. We already have over 1,400 corporations that represent a market capitalization of $12.6 trillion, disclosing their vulnerability to climate value loss. And you have an association of asset owners, 30 institutional investors with a net assets under management of 5 trillion, having already committed to taking their investment portfolio to net zero by 2050. So on the finance side, definitely a fundamental reshaping of finance underway. Let's understand that all of this is progress. It is not the ultimate destination. It is all progress. A lot of progress with corporates, certainly on divestment, and then some iconic corporations like Amazon vowing to be climate neutral by 2040, Apple, Nike, and Starbucks vowing to be net zero by 2030, IKEA, Microsoft, and Google vowing to be climate positive by 2030, meaning they will be absorbing more carbon than they are emitting. All of these companies, what they're doing is they are normalizing the fact that the new corporate responsibility has to include environmental and social issues in addition to profit. So people, planet, profit, the three coming together for corporations, and frankly, accelerating client expectations as well. Renewable energy is going through the roof. We have already 25% of all global grids are renewable energy, and we are projected to increase by 7% this year, despite COVID, and 10% next year. So definitely on an exponential curve for renewables. And I am sure that you're all aware of the revolution that is underway in the transport sector with light vehicles going electric with every manufacturing company, and now the start of green hydrogen for heavy transport, both land and perhaps even maritime. So a fundamental recasting here, I would say, of the response of corporates. Corporates are beginning to understand that it is not only about profit, that they have to take a look at the triple bottom line, profit, people, and planet, and that each of those components is equally important. This is very different, Mary, very different to where we were just 5 years ago. It doesn't mean that the work has been done. Far from it. We still have to accelerate.
Christiana, Pat is back with us now. So
yay.
I think we could move on.
Thank you, Mary, so much for taking charge. And I'm so glad I got to hear that report, Christiana. It gives me such hope. And to use your words, radical optimism followed by facts that we have made progress. But I want to move to Damilola now, who has spent her time working in the power and energy space, being sure that we don't leave out anyone as we move forward in our renewables and in all the progress being made. that these vulnerable populations have the access they need to the energy they need to fuel their lives. Damilola, talk about the work in Nigeria and now as a commissioner for the UN Summit on climate poverty, a new concept that needs to be considered when thinking of climate justice solutions.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. It's just, I have to pinch myself that I'm on a panel with Mary and Christina. So it's just really, really exciting being with such positive leaders, female leaders in the space. I think one of the things I need to kind of bring to everybody's attention is that we're still in a world that 789 million people do not have access to electricity. And more important, 2.8 billion people don't have access to clean cooking. So, while Pat might have some technical problems or I might have some issues with internet, there are people who just do not have access to any of these things. And when you're talking about these people, it means in a scenario like COVID, they cannot stay at home. If they stay at home, they will die. I know it seems a little bit shocking, but it's really, really important to understand that energy access and clean energy access truly does save lives. And we've seen it in what's going on right now. Going back to my role in the Nigerian government, one of the key things I wanted to focus on was providing power using solar energy, mini grids, decentralized energy for communities. But more important, providing power to primary healthcare centers, especially in the rural communities, because these are where the baby hospitals are. It makes a difference between if a child survives and if a child doesn't. And I feel like sometimes when we're having these wider climate conversations, we need to bring it home. We need to bring it so everybody understands just what is really at stake. Coming from Africa, Africa is a victim of climate change. It only probably gives 2% of global emissions, but Africa also needs to industrialize. Women need to be economically empowered. With that, they're going to use more energy. And the conversations have to be around the fact that other countries need to reduce their carbon intake, and Africa might even have to increase it in a cleaner way. So it is more equitable in terms of the solutions in place. Another key thing that, that we need to talk about is the role of renewables, which is huge in Africa. But the truth of the matter is it is so much harder to get financing for renewables than get financing from fossil. That isn't an African problem. That is still a global problem. And then we still have to talk about the key things of like really, really stopping coal, not just saying we're stopping coal. How exactly are we going to actually do it? So for me, I'm just really excited of like, I believe never waste a good crisis. And what this has shown us is that unfortunately, the most vulnerable people are dying because they have no access to anything and they can't physically stay at home. And we have to look for opportunities to actually recover better. And the quickest way to recover better is sustainable clean energy. We know it gives 3.5 x more jobs than the fossil equivalent. We know that if you give a woman entrepreneur sustainable energy, she can earn 59% more than what she earned when she didn't have sustainable energy, which finally puts women at the same par as their male equivalent in many, many developing countries. But again, what is a little bit more disturbing is just the role of what clean cooking also plays, right? There's some facts that are coming out that might seem a little bit morbid, but I do have to share it with you. The truth of the matter is 1 in 7 women in Southern Africa are likely to be raped on the way to get fuel wood, right? So it's beyond a health and safety thing. It's actually a gender-based violence, issue now. And what I plead with everybody, and I know we're going to have a next round, is that while we're talking about scalabilities and renewables and climate, we can't forget people and we can't forget women in this conversation. And they have to be part and parcel of the solution. And that's exactly what I stand for. That is why I took on this role. And I'm just really, really encouraged to, keep advocating, but also implement at the same time. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Damilola. And I'm going to come back to you for some very specific suggestions about how we might support this very important work and the Commission's work to end climate poverty. Mary, you were the first to bring the concept of climate justice to a group of connected women leaders that we were both working with. And you said to each of us that day, I don't care what your priorities are, whether what sector you are working in, you have a role to play as a climate warrior for climate justice. Where are we in this? And how are you assessing? We've heard really, really good reports on progress and yet reminders of how far we have to go to make it just and sustainable, the solutions to the climate emergency. How do you assess where we are now and the role of women in moving us forward?
Well, thank you, Pat. And I actually want to build on what Damilola and indeed Christiana have been saying about the impacts on different sectors, because that's all about how there is a deep injustice. Actually, there are 5 layers of injustice, and I just mention them very briefly because I want to go on to the role of women in addressing this. First of all, there's the injustice that climate disproportionately affects the poorest countries and the poorest communities who are least responsible. The second injustice is that the gender injustice, because women have different power, different social roles, and still have to go further for water or firewood in the drought, as Damilola was telling us. The third injustice is the injustice that the children have been reminding us of, and the young people, the intergenerational injustice. The fourth injustice is the injustice of pathways to development, which means that developed countries got fossil fuel and we have to wean ourselves off. But what about developing countries? They want to go green, but as Damilola has told us, they're not getting the investment and the help that they need, the solidarity. And the fifth injustice is the injustice of nature herself, the fact that we're responsible for the extinction of species, for the loss of biodiversity. We're hurting Mother Nature. So what's the moment? We have a terrible situation, a double whammy of COVID, which is affecting every country and very deeply. And secondly, the looming climate crisis. So this is actually the moment for women's leadership. And it is there. It is there at the international level, in the international institutions, in the International Monetary Fund led by a woman, in the European Development Bank led by a woman, in the European Commission led by a woman, in the World Trade Organization, I hope about to be led by my friend Ngozi, if the US, under Biden, obviously will support her, I hope. And we have it in women's leadership on COVID. We've noted that women leaders of government are doing better. We have it in the many balanced cabinets now and the parliaments, including in countries like Rwanda and Africa, which lead on having 60% of the parliament being women. It's not Scandinavia, it's Rwanda. So we also see the leadership of young people, as Christiana has mentioned, not just Greta Thunberg, but millions like her. Shea Bastida is a good friend of mine, a young 18-year-old Mexican who's given such leadership, and many others. And we've seen the leadership of indigenous communities, Hindu Omaro Ibrahim. I've written in my climate justice book about many of these women because they so inspire me. This is the moment. And now in the United States, we have Kamala Harris. I listened to her speech as vice president-elect, and she knew what her moment was and what it was all about and how to somehow inspire all of us to gather this women's leadership and go forward. And I hope we can talk more about this in the second round.
In fact, Mary, let's start with you now on this very subject of the gathering in which we are meeting today, women leaders from every sector who are eager, I am sure, to join this climate justice movement. What specific suggestions, actions, call, advocacy could you recommend, Mary?
I think there are 3 things we can all do. First of all, because it's so serious, we have to take the climate crisis personally in our lives. And we have to, do something that shows that we've done that. In other words, change our way of recycling, change our diet, do something different, own the problem. And you'll feel much better if you do own it, in fact. Secondly, we have to get angry and active about those more responsible, or if we're in positions of responsibility like government, to do more, to actually be more ambitious about setting targets, etc. And the third thing we have to do is we have to imagine this world that we're hovering towards. Now, why does women's leadership matter? I'll just capture this in a few words, and I'm sure both of my colleagues will have more to say. Women's leadership is problem solving. It's collaborative. It's listening. It's listening to the experts, listening to the science, to the health experts on COVID, to the climate scientists on science. It's bringing people with you with a trust that you are there for them because you're serving. It's a leadership of service of others. This is the way women are leading in so many different ways, in so many different capacities, and the world needs this now and urgently and collectively.
And we have about 2.5 minutes left to give further charges and calls to action to this community of women and leaders and male allies waiting to become engaged and active. Damilola, how do we support your work?
Well, in the energy sector, just, we need to talk about it. Young people have to go into government. I was heading an agency in Nigeria at the age of 27, and you really have to just make that stance and that sacrifice to enter a leadership role. If you have anything about energy access, energy transition, please contact me directly. We're having a dedicated youth summit next year because we also felt that there's a lot of climate leaders and there are not enough energy leaders as well, and the two have to come together. We're also, for the first time in 40 years, the UN is having a high-level dialogue on energy, and I'll be reaching out to the colleagues as well. This is 40 years, this is as long as I've been alive, and the issue is finally getting to the General Assembly. So we have to have brand new commitments in terms of SDG 7. We are not going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 if we do not achieve access for all by 2030. So those are the key points we really have to take away from.
And thank you for your leadership here and reminding us of the way in which climate poverty and climate justice are interconnected and interrelated, as are all the solutions. Christiana, we come to you, who provided the world with its first big hope that we would address this and we would choose a different future. Your calls to action to this group of leaders with us today.
Well, beyond totally agreeing with Damilola and with Mary, my greatest fear is indifference. I think we have to make a very conscious choice to eradicate indifference to everything, to climate change, to social inequalities, to non-access, to so many different services. It is the bane of our society, is indifference. And how do we do that? We women, we think of ourselves as women, as planetary mothers, as aunts, grandmothers, who share the stewardship for this planet and for future generations. And we look at every single little nook and corner where we have influence, and we ask ourselves a very simple question. In the way I eat, in the way I transport myself, in the way that I am dealing with everything in my life, investment decisions, corporate decisions, family decisions, am I acting as the most responsible steward for planet and future generations? Because that is who women are. If the answer to that is yes, then we're doing the right thing. If the answer to that is no, then we have to change what we're doing. Just ask yourself, am I being the most responsible steward for planet and people?
And on that note and that question that we will all ask ourselves, may I say great gratitude to the three of you for the work you lead in the world, Mary for stepping in when there was a power shortage here, and for all of us to take the power that is invested in us as leaders and move it forward for a sustainable, just, and equitable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Damilola. Bye.